Welcome, welcome, welcome. You're listening to Jay's Analysis. And we are going live. Gonna let the audience trickle in here a little bit. See if we can build up a little bit of a watcher, viewership, listenership, excuse me, before we actually get going with the debate, before I send him. No, we're not late. I'm just, I'm on the road, so I'm at a bit of a disadvantage. I don't have my library with me. And I'm not really familiar with Dr. Feingold. Actually, we have mutual friends. Been friends with some guys for about a decade that set this up. And I'm glad to do this because it's been so long since I've done a real debate with a trained person in these kinds of ideas. We get the internet philosophers, but we don't often get trained academic types. So I'm going to send him the link now, and I'm going to be going from memory here. I've got some of my articles pulled up because I'm on the road, but I didn't want to say no to this debate. And if need be, we may down the road have successive debates that deal with, maybe questions that get raised in this debate, right? So since I'm on the road, I don't have my Summa with me. I don't have the Summa contra Gentiles. I don't have my Thomistic commentaries. I'm going to be going from memory. But again, it's not that hard to know what Thomas's doctrine of divine simplicity is. It's pretty clearly stated multiple times in volume 1 of the Summa and in volume 1 of the Summa contra Gentiles. So I've sent him the link, so he should be coming in pretty soon. And I imagine it'll be a pretty laid back debate. Dr. Feingold, how are you?
Good. How are you? Should I call you Mr. Dyer? Or you can just call me Francis. I'll call you Jay.
Okay, that's cool. Thanks for doing the debate, man. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
Yeah, I appreciate Justin putting it together. I know he was kind of looking for somebody to do a debate for a while, and I think you would be a perfect category or perfect person for this category. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your research, and that I think you did your dissertation on Thomas, right?
Sure. Yeah. So my dissertation, which I defended last November, was on divine impassibility in Aquinas. So specifically trying to deal with the problem of how to reconcile standard Thomistic doctrines like pure actuality and divine simplicity with the dependence of the lover on the beloved, which seems to imply passibility. And are you still there? Because
you might want to cut your camera off because it'll use a lot of bandwidth, and we might want to just
sure.
audio.
Let's see if I can figure out how to do that. There we go.
Yeah.
Cool. Does that work?
Yeah, that'll probably be a little smoother now.
Sounds good.
And I want to add to the audience that we'll be are you cool with taking questions?
Of course.
Okay, so people in the audience, if you want to do super chat questions, we'll take those. As usual, I always split the super chats with the guests. So Dr. Feingold will get half of the super chat questions that you guys ask. So come up with some good ones as we discuss here. I'm thinking maybe we could do a pretty free-flowing conversation style. It doesn't have to be formal debate, mainly because I'm not at my library. So I'm on the road and I'm kind of going from memory. You have the home court advantage if you've got your library.
Well, sort of. I just have my laptop. But
okay, well, that's fine. So how do we want to start this off? Do you want to let me ask you, are you very familiar with Eastern theology or like the Eastern?
No, I can't claim a lot of familiarity. I have a couple of paragraphs on polymos in my dissertation, but that's about it. So if you want to, maybe it would be good to do something like this, where you give the basic polymite position, which I take it you'll be defending.
Yes.
For it, I'll give the basic elevator pitch for Aquinas, and then we can start probing.
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that the Palomite position actually isn't the position just of St. Gregory Palamas. In fact, it's a doctrine that I would say pretty clearly is taught in St. Basil's letter 234, where he explicitly makes a distinction between the essence and energy, or the essence and the operations of God.
Right.
If we look at St. John of Damascus's Orthodox faith, in multiple times throughout the work, he makes the distinction between the essence and energy of God. Of course, in book 1, he will say that the energy of God is one. And then he goes on to say that the energy of God is also multiple. For us, that's a one in the many question where we don't actually see a dialectic, but in fact, the energies of God or actions of God are multiple. And later on the Orthodox faith, he even clarifies this in a more intense way when he talks about the energies in Christ in the incarnation. So, specifically, the relationship between the two natural wills and operations or energies in the two natures. This, of course, is because the Sixth Ecumenical Council dealt extensively with debating the monothelites on the question of Christ in the incarnation having two wills and two energies proper to those natures. So I would argue, as St. Gregory of Palamas does against Barlaam, and as St. Maximus the Confessor did against Pyrrhus the Monothelite, that the nature-grace question and the question of the essence and energies distinction in the incarnation is even clearer when we understand that there's no dialectics. So there's no dialectics in the relationship between nature and grace. There's no dialectics between the relationship of Christ's human nature and energy participating in the divine nature and energy. So in other words, the uncreated energies of God, it's not just a question of God's relationship to creation, but it's also solidified dogmatically and theologically in the Sixth Ecumenical Council when it deals with this specific question. If you read the debate between St. Maximus and Pyrrhus, you'll see that Maximus relies throughout in that 150-page treatise on this being a real distinction. This real distinction allows for God to remain transcendent in his essence and yet come down to us and allow us to participate in his uncreated glory and life. Jesus says in John 17 that he came to give us the same glory that he shares with the Father from all eternity. That glory, that light is not created, it is in fact uncreated. And it's not something that just is postponed to an intellectual vision in the afterlife or the beatific vision. And in fact, it's something that's participated in here and now. And we know that by the fact of the incarnation. In fact, when the fathers at the Sixth Ecumenical Council and at the Fifth, by the way, talk about the incarnation, they speak of the humanity of Christ as being deified via the incarnation. Again, this process is done by the uncreated energies which proceed from the divine nature, certainly, although they're not the exact same as the divine nature in our view. That is the means by which the humanity of Christ participates in the divine life. That's explicitly stated, quoting from St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Gregory of Nazianzus in the theological orations at the Fifth and Sixth Council. So it's repeated, it's reaffirmed. We also have statements at the Council of Ephesus citing St. Cyril of Alexandria against Nestorius that the bread and the wine in a similar way participate in these divine energies. There are multiple references to these same ideas in the liturgies of the East, all of which talk about the operations of God. The baptismal rite, for example, talks about calling down the energies of God into the baptismal font. And again, it's all just based on our Christological understanding, which we see as, again, dogmatically stating in the Sixth and Fifth Council that the energies deify the humanity. So that model of deification of Christ's humanity is the model for the individual believer, the individual baptized Christian, as they participate in God through the church, through the sacraments, and that participation is a real participation, but it's a participation in the uncreated glory and uncreated light, uncreated grace of God, not a created grace. So I would contrast this with what's later dogmatized, so not just theoretically or philosophically speculated upon in Aquinas in terms of how there might be a relationship between this absolutely simple essence and created beings, or this absolutely simple essence and the one person of the Trinity somehow becoming incarnate. Rather, it is the question of the Roman dogmas. And the Roman dogmas do eventually state, and I think I'm vindicated by this, not just in my reading of what's at the Roman councils, particularly like Trent or Vatican I, where dogmatic divine simplicity is stated pretty clearly. You also have the outworkings of this in terms of created grace. Trent has, if I recall, going from memory, a condemnation of different speculations about what kind of grace and justification is actually given in baptism. And one of the things that's condemned is the idea that it's not created grace. So in other words, the grace that is stamped upon our soul, the sanctifying grace, is a created effect. And of course, this is again in that sort of Aristotelian causal format of God, the cause, and then we receive the effects of that cause. But the effects that we receive are in fact created. And I would argue that the reason that Rome has this issue is precisely because eventually in the dogma, the uncreated grace, essence, energy, distinction doctrine was eventually lost. So it was perfectly fine in terms of up into the 6th, 7th, 8th council, if you count the 8th, our 8th, that is, where it was stated explicitly. But it eventually, I would say, after the rise of Frankish dominance, Charlemagne, the Carolinians, you eventually have this dogma kind of being lost and forgotten, and Roman Catholic theology pretty much settles into a pretty ossified, solidified doctrine of what divine simplicity is. So there are a lot of errors. I'm going to close up here with this opening statement. I think that's the main point. We would say that there's a lot of errors that kind of flow out of this that you can tease out. And so my first clarification is that I'm not debating whether Thomas had good intentions. I'm not debating whether Thomas in other places in the Summa said things correctly. I'm not here to debate Augustine's intentions or Anselm's intentions, but rather just specifically whether or not the things that are stated, say, in Book 1 of Summa Theologica and in Book 1 of the Summa Contra Gentiles about what divine simplicity is, if that actually makes sense with and comports with what is stated elsewhere about how there is a real distinction of persons, because to us it doesn't seem that there could be a real distinction of persons if distinction implies composition or division. In fact, that's a direct borrowing from Plotinus. It's Plotinus who first said, following other Greek philosophers before him, that all consideration of distinction implies division or composition. And for us, we see that as many times refuted, particularly in the Christological heresies, but also in the triadological formations of the early church. So for us, all of these questions are linked. The doctrine of God, how he relates to creation, also the doctrine of Christology, the doctrine of the sacraments, and the doctrine of eschatology are all intimately connected, and ecclesiology, in terms of how we view the essence, energy distinction and whether we believe that it's possible or not. So when it comes to Aquinas's conclusions, I'll say that for my later critique, given the fact that, for example, I don't see how creation can be a free action of God if we accept his doctrine of divine simplicity and the idea that all the actions of God are absolutely isomorphically identical to the essence of God. I don't see how we can say that there's a real incarnation if God is an absolutely simple essence, or, for example, how we would avoid patripassianism if God is an absolutely simple essence. In other words, that one hypostasis of the Trinity couldn't enter into a mode of being that the others do not. So, for example, the Father is not crucified. The Father does not become incarnate. It's only the Son. But if God is an absolutely simple essence in which the distinctions imply composition or division, it becomes difficult to see how there is a real incarnation, how God's actions within time and space are real actions signifying the divine power. For example, it's common amongst the early fathers to speak of Christ's human nature being evident when he cries or when he eats. But we see the fathers also making a strong argument for the divine power operant in Christ or through Christ when he walks on water, when he does miracles, when he raises the dead. Those are actions proper to the divine nature, and they're real powers entering into time and space from the divine nature itself. Now, we don't believe the divine nature enters into time and space, but in fact that it is possible for the uncreated to enter into time and space because of our belief in the essence energy distinction. And I'll close with, I would say, our strongest case in that regard is the fact that for us, the theophanies of the Old Testament, up until Augustine in Book 3 of On the Trinity is when it's first questioned The Eastern Fathers never question the belief that it is not created holograms or angels that are present, for example, in Exodus 3 of the burning bush, or in Exodus 23 where God says, I will put my name in my angel, the angel of the Lord. It is consistently believed that these theophanies are the pre-incarnate presence of Christ himself. Thomism and Augustinian debates and discussions and on the Trinity and questioning of this led to the possibility that, or led to the conclusion that it's difficult to see how an absolutely simple Trinitarian essence could manifest within time and space. Therefore, we have to accept that these are just angelic created forms. We don't believe that they're angelic created forms, and neither do the church fathers, who argue that this is the Logos manifesting within time and space. How is that possible? It's possible because of the essence energy distinction. So I will close with that and as my opening statement, and let you speak.
All right. Well, there's quite a bit there, obviously. So I may be leaving something out, but it sounds as though we've got maybe 5 or 6 areas that you've covered, right? So you've got, I don't know if you talked about this one explicitly, but you've got the distinction of attributes within God. You're going to have the problem of God's actions with respect to the world. You've got the problem of the Trinity. You've got the problem of the hypostatic union and the communication of idioms. And you have the problem of nature and grace and what it means to say that we share in God's life. And yes, I'm not sure that all of these are the same problem. So we should probably take those piece by piece, and I'll try to get to that in a minute. Since you did a little thing saying what you were clarifying is what you were trying to do and what you're not trying to do, I'll do a little bit of the same. So I'm not a theologian by trade, and my job, the thing which I'm trying to do here isn't primarily to make sense of council documents or the fathers. What I'm trying to do is to make sense of the coherence of Aquinas' doctrine of divine simplicity as best as I understand it. Okay. And I've messed around with the Trinity some. I'm not an expert on the Aquinas' theory of the hypostatic union, so what I'll be saying about that will be mostly guesswork. So I'm just throwing that out as caveats here. But yeah, and what you said about impugning motivations, I thoroughly agree with that. I think we're both here to try to safeguard God's transcendence and tri-unity as best as we can. All right, so let me start my elevator pitch, which I'll try to keep fairly short, just by explaining why somebody like Aquinas would find the doctrine of divine simplicity appealing. And then we can go over how, in the context of that doctrine, you try to make sense of the other things that you talked about. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay. So the basic, right, the reason for affirming divine simplicity comes from affirming the philosophical and obviously theological doctrine of the first cause. What does it mean to say that there is a being who is absolutely first? What does it mean to say that there is a being which, unlike any being that we know of, does not need a further explanation behind itself? So all of Aquinas' famous proofs for God's existence, and this goes for Aristotle as well, are going to argue from our experience in the created world of things which are a certain way but didn't have to be, and arguing from that to a cause which you might say, not to use Aquinas' own terms, but something which is the sufficient reason of its own being that way, right? So the argument from motion, we see things that change. We see things that move. What does that mean? That means we see something which was in potency, becomes actualized, and we want to figure out why on earth did it do that? What's responsible for its going from potency into act? And you can say there was something else that actualized it, that's fine, but then you've got to ask the same question about it. Does it have an actualized potency? If so, what made that one actualized? And so you're going to keep on chasing that ball until you come up with something which has no potency, but just is pure actuality, right? So that's the famous Thomistic doctrine of actus purus, which I'm sure you're well familiar with. And Aquinas thinks that it's, once you grant the pure act doctrine, in other words, that there's nothing in God whose reality has to be explained by something outside of itself. There's nothing in God that could have been otherwise, that was made to be the way it is by something that wasn't itself. Once you grant that, Aquinas thinks that it's a short step to the doctrine of absolute simplicity. Because for Aquinas, whenever you have parts, what you're going to have is some sort of potency-act relationship, right? So when you have, when there are different kinds of parts, I'm not sure how familiar you are with Aquinas' mereology, with his study of parts and wholes. Right, so the most obvious kind of parts is going to be integral parts, right? So like the bricks that make up a house, right? So in the case of the bricks that make up a house, you've got actually some mutual dependence relations going, right? Because the house wouldn't be a house unless it was built up out of these parts, right? So there's dependence there. But likewise, these bricks only actually count as what they are, the parts of the house, because of their dependence on the whole, right? Your cells are human cells because they're part of your human body. And so with regular integral or quantitative parts, as they're sometimes called, you're not going, you don't want to predicate those of God, because then you'd be introducing potency into what by definition can't have it. If it did have it, then you'd have to ask what actualized the potency, and you wouldn't have reached the actual first cause yet. So that's for integral parts. Usually what people are worried about when, at least people who grant that God's immaterial, what they're worried about when they object to divine simplicity isn't integral parts. It's usually going to be accidents, right? Either the kind of accident which Aquinas would call extraneous accidents, which in us would be things like color and shape and size and all that stuff, or proper accidents, which for us would be things like the powers of our soul, things which we can't help but having given our nature. So why can't there be a multiplicity in God of those? And so Aquinas' basic answer here is going to be, well, anytime that you have so there's a couple of different lines of argument. Here's why. Anytime that you have a subject and a feature of that subject, right? So there's me and there's my color. That feature, that accident, makes the subject be in a certain way. In other words, right, me, as just as a human being, I can be all sorts of different colors. I've got potency. And what the accident does is it actualizes that potency in a certain way. Makes me be actually tan or whatever. And that would imply that it does imply that what's being actualized is of itself potential. And so we don't want to predicate accidents of, certainly of tanness or color of God, because among other things, he doesn't have a body. We don't want to predicate accidents of wisdom or justice of God either, because again, that would be to imply that what God is, the subject of which you're predicating these accidents, lacked that actuality. And so the Thomistic claims that when we say that God is wise, I'm not saying that there's an extra metaphysical reality which I'm plugging into the metaphysical reality which is God. I'm rather saying that the metaphysical reality which is God, I can capture a facet of that, if you like, by my word wise. And so that's one line of argument. And that argument would be that if you were to say that God had an accident distinct from himself, then that would mean that this accident was actualizing God, and thus that God was in potency, and thus that God could not be really the first cause, and thus wouldn't be God. The other line of argument would be, I call it the limiting line of argument. And so the idea would be this. Once you grant, and we'd have to do a couple more steps to show this, but once you grant that God is the fullness of existence, right? So if you grant the actus purus claim, and you also grant the ipsum esse claim, and I can defend that if you like, then right, you're saying that God is this pure fullness of existence of itself. And to say that the pure fullness of existence itself is something limited, which would be the case if I were to say that this pure fullness of existence itself had this little doohickey attached to it called wisdom, which was different from it and different from these other attributes, then I would be saying that the infinite and the pure and the what is per se through itself is something limited and participated. And Aquinas thinks that that's also in flat contradiction to the claim that God is the first cause in which all other things participate, but who himself participates in nothing. So I take it those are the two main lines of arguments against positing accidents, really distinct from God, inhering in him. Now, we would have to do a little bit of work to pair what you're calling energies with accidents. One more thing, and then we can get into the trying to poke at the difficulties in each other's positions. So you talked about operations in particular. The word energeia obviously comes from the Greek word, which is most commonly used for operation. Aristotle uses it that way, although he also uses it sometimes to talk about form, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's this question of whether these arguments against divine accidents would also apply to would also apply to divine actions. Aquinas seems to think that they do. Right? So he classifies actions as a kind of accident, and so he wants to rule out all actions from God for the same reason that he rules out distinct accidents like justice and wisdom and mercy and stuff like that. It's not clear to me, so I'm a bit of a heterodox Thomist, I'm putting my cards on the table here. It's not clear to me that actions and formal accidents should actually be considered on the same plane. I think you can make a principled case for allowing a real distinction of God's creature-directed actions from himself in a way in which you can't make a good argument for real distinction of his attributes from himself. And we can get into my crazy theories for why that's the case later. Okay, so that's my basic argument for Aquinas' position as I understand it. Should I try to go through the various theological points that you're bringing up, or do you want to speak to what I just said?
Well, one thing I would say to in response is that first, we do affirm that God is simple. Every Orthodox doctrine, every Eastern Father, and all the fathers, Western fathers as well,
right?
We all agree on simplicity. So it's not really a question of do we teach divine simplicity, but what in fact do we mean by that? For us, one of the key theological treatises is on the Orthodox faith, and of course Aquinas specifically deals with in his treatise on divine simplicity. He specifically deals with questions from John of Damascus, right? Specifically on the essence energy distinction. So sometimes in Orthodox theology, yes, operations, energeia, that's actually used in the New Testament multiple times of divine activity. So it signifies divine activity within time and space. But there's another important aspect that I should add to here, that for Orthodox, this actually solves a lot of the disputes between the East and the West over the filioque and Trinitarian questions, which I'm not trying to get into that, but it is important germane to our discussion, because we don't believe that it's necessarily the case that there's only actions of God towards creation and or eternity. Now, in a sense, yes, there could be. I mean, there are those two things, but what I'm trying to say is that we believe in a level of energetic manifestation. So, for example, when many of the church fathers talk about the Spirit being manifested eternally from the Son, that is our doctrine, which is laid out at the Council of Blachernae as eternal manifestation. We see that as different from hypostatic origin of the Spirit. So the reason I say that is because it's not just the Spirit eternally manifesting the Son and the Spirit resting in the Son, as St. Gregory of Palamas and St. John of Damascus say. It's John of Damascus who makes this distinction between eternal manifestation and hypostatic origin. This is why St. John doesn't teach the filioque, and in fact he rejects it. He says that there's no cause or producer of the Spirit other than the Father. The Son does eternally manifest the Spirit, and not just that, the Son and the entire Trinity manifest. In other words, all the Trinitarian operations are from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, and this applies to eternal manifestation as well. So, for example, some attributes of God are appropriate to all eternity. God's love has eternally manifested for all eternity in that Trinitarian way. God's goodness has eternally manifested that way. But some actions of God, as you said, are appropriate to time and space, to history. St. Gregory Palamas and St. Maximus make this distinction. They talk about how God's justice, for example, in relationship to Sodom and Gomorrah, that was something that occurred within time and space and passed away. Some of God's actions occur within time and space and continue on into eternity. For example, the creation of the church, setting up of the church, and so forth, the incarnation of Christ. These begin in time and space, and they continue on into eternity. So not all actions of God are necessarily just related to the intertrinitarian life, God ad intra, or God ad extra. There's also for us a very important other level of energetic manifestation, which is a helpful distinction and actually explains what is oftentimes confused in Roman Catholic teaching on the filioque. So I just wanted to add that caveat, and also the second caveat that we don't actually accept actus purus. So you began your opening statement by saying, well, if we accept the first cause argument and the actus purus position, then it does logically lead to these other things. And I would say you're right, it does. We would agree with that. However, we just simply don't accept that starting point. And this is the thing that I think most Thomists don't question, is what if we just question that starting point? What if we just reject
which starting point?
The Plotinian and the Origenistic doctrine, the Greek doctrine, the Hellenic doctrine of what simplicity is. For example, Plotinus in the Aeneas, he says, God is an absolutely simple intellectual essence. God is...
Sorry, hold on, because that's not the starting point. The starting point is just the notion of God as first cause. Is that what you're attacking?
Well, what I'm saying is that you can reason back through to talking about a first cause. It doesn't matter whether you want it. When we're talking about divine simplicity, the starting point is that cause has to be absolutely simple.
No, that's not the starting point. The starting point is that there has to be a first cause, and we prove from the notion.
Well, okay, but we have a completely different ordo theologia. We don't do that kind of a reasoning back to the first cause. That's an Aristotelian doctrine. Now, church fathers talk about a first cause, but we don't talk about reasoning back to the first cause in order to get to a definition of God as simple, and then later by supernature we tack on the persons. Orthodox theology is completely reversed. It's the other way around. We start with revelation from God and Christ, and that's how we don't know naturally about God being a first cause and then later God having three persons. It begins with a personal revelation of I am that I am. This is why St. Gregory Palamas says to Barlaam, God doesn't say I am existent being, I am the super essence. He says I am he. For example, when St. Basil argues against Eunomius, and he specifically argues on the question of what the one is, toon, he argues that it is a personal claim. Right? It is about hypostasis. It is I am he. It is not I am essence, I am super being, I am whatever. It's I am he. So even, I know that you want to say, I'm not starting with super essence. I'm starting with first reasoning back to first cause and then predicating about analogically about what this essence is. What I'm saying to you is that we just reject that whole process, that whole order.
Hold on. So there could be two things here. So maybe you're saying that you just don't think that any proofs for God's existence work. Is that what you're claiming?
No, we believe in the transcendental argument as most compatible with Orthodox theology. St. John Damascus makes the transcendental argument. But yes, I do believe the classical arguments don't work very well, precisely before this issue.
Well, we can precisely because of what?
Because of this issue that we're talking about.
So you mean they don't work because they get you into a place you don't want to be?
No, I mean, I argue with atheists all the time and refute them quite frequently because of the transcendental argument. So it doesn't lead me to a place.
No, I don't mean that you don't want don't want there to be a God. What I meant is you don't like the five ways, for example, because they would imply divine simplicity. Is that what you're saying?
They are bad arguments based on classical foundationalist epistemology, and Orthodox anthropology doesn't make sense with classical foundationalist epistemology.
Okay, so I think I would like for this discussion to be fruitful. I think we should do maybe two things. Maybe this is a rabbit hole, so tell me if you don't want to do this. But so on the one hand, I think it would be good to probe this five ways issue a bit, because I agree with you that if we think that those are bunk, then your arguments for divine simplicity are going to be shorn of their foundation. But here's this other thing. So it's right. So let me grant to you for a minute that your starting point as a Christian should be revelation rather than natural reason. Okay, so start from God speaking in the burning bush rather than what we can know by the revelation which is written in the world around us, to paraphrase St. Paul. Right, so granting that, surely you would still want to maintain that whatever the God of revelation is, it's not caused. And it's the sort of thing whose explanation you don't have to seek, right?
Sure. I mean, Eastern Fathers will say at times God is first cause. St. John of Damascus says that. Sure.
And so what I'm trying to do, and what I think divine simplicity does, is it's a logical consequence of a coherent claim that God is the first cause. And so if you don't think that it follows from the claim that God is the first cause, I would be interested to see where you think that argument comes apart. I can restate the argument.
Sure. Why does the first cause have to be absolutely simple? Why can't there be
Sure.
a composite first cause? I mean, in other words, I have to accept a whole bunch of other logical, philosophical tags.
Of course, and I'm trying to figure out which of those premises you're attacking. Right, so the premise in question here would be, whenever you have two things that are, right, so when I have an attribute, let's say, let's just, can we go with that as an example of composition?
Okay, but now go ahead.
Okay, right, so when I have an attribute, right, again, that's going to mean that the subject, according to the framework I'm using, right, the subject has been actualized by this distinct reality, which is inhering in it. And so it seems as though if you're going to grant that the composition of subject and accident can be analyzed into a relation of potency and act, and you want to maintain that God does not have potency, then you're going to have to grant that God
don't maintain that.
Subject and accident. Now, there are more premises there, so go ahead.
But we don't maintain that. Again,
you don't maintain which part?
We don't believe that God is pure act with no potentia.
Okay, so let's rewind then. So it seems as though when I look around at ordinary things, right, and I see that I'm staring at the coffee mug on my desk. I see that it is this certain shape. Mm-hmm. And I can ask why, right? And that's a good question to ask, right? It doesn't explain itself. It didn't have that shape and that color just because of the nature of the matter that makes it up, right? So I need to seek outside of the cup for the reason why the cup is and why it is this way. And it's precisely because the cup didn't have to be this way.
Yeah, I mean, I understand.
So in other words, whenever you have
Aristotle's
what you've got is something which didn't have to be this way. And whenever you've got something which is this way but didn't have to be this way, you need to ask why. Okay. And so I'm saying that if you say that God has potency and it's actualized, then you need to explain why that happened.
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is that if I adopt the Thomistic doctrine of what simplicity is, and if I identify God's actions with his essence, then it's very difficult to see, and I would say you can't argue that creation is actually a free action of God. Now, all historic Orthodox theology.
Hold on.
Because the act of creating the world.
I know this objection quite well.
Okay. Well, there's more to this objection, which I bet you don't know, which is that it's not just a matter of whether or not the action of creating was constrained by God's essence because they're identified. There's also a question of the divine exemplars. This is because Aquinas multiple times in the Summa identifies the exemplars, the ideas behind the created things, with the essence of God. Now, if creation is based on the exemplars, then creation, it's hard to see how it's not also just as unchanging and eternal as the exemplars upon which they're based. And this is why Orthodox theology, this is why St. Maximus, St. Gregory, they don't identify the ideas or the logoi with the essence of God. They are the things around God. This is why Dionysius the Areopagite, who Aquinas cites multiple times, that makes the distinction between essence and energy. This is why Dionysius says that you can never get to God's essence, and you can't even via negativa reason about God's essence. It's not just a question of univocal or analogical. Analogical.
Maybe. That's another question which we should save for a little bit. But
analogical doesn't work either because of the doctrine of divine simplicity as stated by Aquinas.
Yeah. Okay. So first thing, like I would like to keep the argument which I just gave separate from that one, right? So there's two things that both of us need to do in this debate, right? So one of them is make the case for why our position has to be, why we think it has to be the way it is, and the other one is to defend against objections to it, right? So when I'm giving you the potency act argument, right, that's why I think it has to be the case, and then I need to defend against objections like, and then how do you make sense of freedom? Right, so likewise,
Okay, but
right,
what
you're
if the
saying
person?
here's
What if
one
the
of the reasons
person?
why
What
I
if the
believe
person?
in the energy's essence. Hold on just a sec. Right, you're saying you need to one of the reasons why you believe in the energy's essence distinction is because you think it's necessary to safeguard divine freedom, and
Well,
then
I
you have
believe
to
it
reply to
because it's revealed. It's taught in
potency
Scripture.
act as an objection, right? So let's just keep these two separate things separate.
I believe it because it's revealed, and I also believe my view of what God is in terms of simplicity because it's revealed. I don't begin by looking at the composition of created things like coffee cups and try to reason back and say, well, there must have been a first simple cause that's not like a composite coffee cup. In fact, I don't have to go that route. And when you look at the early church fathers, when you look at the way Scripture talks about these things, it's a revealed doctrine, both of the persons and of what God's nature is, which we don't know what it is, of course. So no, we don't begin, as Paul says in Acts 17, the divine ousia is not like any created thing when he's arguing with.
You don't need to argue with me about that. That's actually kind of both of our points. So anyway, keep going.
But Thomas also wants his cake and to eat it too, because he also says that this absolutely simple divine essence does that there is an analogical similarity between what's in this essence, the divine exemplars, and the created forms. And the created forms are nothing like an absolutely simple essence. So there's a divide where there's not a bridge between this absolutely simple essence because there's no uncreated grace. There's no bridge between the absolutely simple uncreated and the created, and they share no similarity. Then there's no basis for the analogia entis, or the participation in God in terms of redemption. It's all created grace. It's all bridged off by Thomas's doctrine of simplicity. Now I recognize again that he wants there to be distinctions of persons. He wants there to be God acting within time and space in terms of the incarnation, the logos somehow entering into a mode of being that the Father and the Spirit do not. But our contention is that in the system as a whole, with all Thomas's claims and presuppositions, it doesn't work. It's contradictory.
Yeah. No, let's keep. So we've got three issues on the table as of this moment, right? So we've got on the one hand my question, which you haven't answered yet, which is why is it that a composite of potency and act wouldn't need an explanation? You have a second question, which is you've addressed to me, which I haven't answered yet, which is how would it be possible for an absolutely simple God to be free? And then there's the third question, which is an epistemological question, which is if we grant that the divine essence is transcendent, what are our predicates latching onto, right? And that's the problem with analogy. And so those are, I think, three separate issues, and we should probably go over them one by one.
Okay, so the first one is, I've already answered it. I said, first of all, we don't accept that God is pure act with no potentiality.
No, that's not an answer, though, right? Because the what you need to explain to me is why is it, right? So it
is an answer because in Christian theology, God is not explained in that way. He's revealed a certain way. So what my answer to you is that we don't have an answer to Aquinas, to Aristotle's dilemma of accidents and substance, because that's not how we look at and view God. We don't use that system. It wasn't used for the first 1,000 years. So I don't have to answer that question because it's not applicable to how we know who God is. We know who God is through revelation and through participating in that revealed light.
Right. We're all on board with saying that revelation is true, right? But the question is, right? So I would challenge you to find examples in the scripture of saying that God is in potency to attributes or stuff like that.
I just told you
so if you're going to say that God has potency,
you keep asking me where can I
as much inferential work as I do, at least.
You keep asking me to use Aristotelian terminology and classifications and categories, and I just told you that we don't, and they're not in Scripture, and they're not in the first 1,000 years of the Church Fathers. Generally speaking,
the thing that you had said first was that you're fine with saying that God has potency. Or at least
I was trying to speak to your terminology, for example, in Bradshaw's essays in his book, where he says that if we follow through with saying that God has no potentiality, it's difficult to see how there's a free act of creation. But I'm moving the step back further, and I'm saying we reject your doctrine of what simplicity is because it's direct from Origen and Plato.
I'm not interested in arguments from authority or where claims came from. What I'm trying to figure out is
that's the first 1,000 years of the church's debate.
Right?
Of course it matters. Of course it matters where they came from. If you're just rehashing Plotinus, then that's a problem. And Aquinas does that.
No. I mean, look, what we're trying to do, or at least here's what I'm trying to do, right? So we've got revelation. We know by revelation a couple things. We know more than a couple. We know that there is one God, that he is the first cause of all things, that he is three persons, and that the second person became man and died for our sins.
I mean, have you ever considered a person?
Obviously, it matters if something is directly contained in revelation. But like where like these distinctions came from, I mean, I'm not sure why that's germane, right? So to say that Plotinus originated this way of understanding what it means to be the first God. Cool.
So
right? I mean, why does that matter? This is just a methodological.
It does matter. It does matter because it's the doctrine of the heretics and the doctrine of the Greeks that the early councils rejected. So every time the Christological controversies happen, they argue against guys who were influenced by Greek thought. This actually comes up in the writings of the fathers and in the councils. They say you've been influenced by the Hellenic ideas of what simplicity is. So if Plotinus talks about simplicity in a certain way and in which it identifies all the names or attributes of the one with the essence of the one, and then when Eunomius says the exact same thing, and St. Gregory of Nyssa writes an 800-page book against Eunomius and makes this very argument saying, hey, Eunomius, you got your argument from Plotinus, I would say that I can just simply repeat that same argument against you because Aquinas rehashes the same argument from Eunomius and from Plotinus. So absolutely it matters.
What you're telling me, though, is that somebody who, by dint of using reason alone with no help from revelation, says some true things and some false things.
No, that's not.
You, who have the revelation, should discard the baby with the bathwater. That's what I'm hearing. Right, like when I say
most of the Eastern Fathers were fine with classical pedagogy. So you're making a straw man. I didn't say that we have to throw out all philosophy or anything like that. I'm going to question it.
If it's the case that the fact that Plotinus said something means that it's wrong,
that's the origin of this heresy.
I'm not willing to accept that proposition.
Okay, do you understand
dialectics? Beg pardon?
Do you understand dialectics? Right. So when the early church fathers are arguing against somebody like Celsus, or whether they're arguing against Arius, or whether they're arguing against Eunomius, they often talk about how these heretics employed dialectics. And so, for example, it's Plotinus who pioneered this, right? It doesn't matter whether it's Plotinus who said it or whether it's Nestorius who said it. The same heresy is being restated. Who cares who said it if it's wrong in principle? So I'll grant you that. Yes, it doesn't matter ultimately who said it. But I'm saying that when the church fathers argue against these things, they absolutely are concerned with the origin or the wellspring of where these errors come from. And I'm telling you that we reject the Greek philosophical origin of how we understand what simplicity is, and we actually just go to what's revealed. That's what the church fathers do. That's why they reject Hellenic dialectics every time there's a council, and particularly the Sixth Council.
My only point is I'm not going to accept it as a valid counter argument that you say that this principle or whatever was articulated by Plotinus, and Plotinus held some heretical views, therefore we must not hold this principle. That's not a valid
argument. The argument is your doctrine of simplicity is the same as Plotinus's, and it's heretical.
Yeah, and it's certainly not the same as Plotinus's, because Plotinus didn't hold the Trinity, right? The emanation of nous from the wall.
I already answered this early on. I already answered early on when I said that the question wasn't whether Thomas also said correct things elsewhere, but whether the doctrine of simplicity itself wasn't the exact same as what Plotinus said. And when Plotinus says that all the acts and names and operations of God or the one are exactly the same as the essence, that's the same as what Aquinas says. And so this is why Origen was led to say that the Son is a different subsistence, or a different kind of created subsistence, different from the Father, because he identified the hypostasis of the Father with the essence. This is why Eunomius identified the Father with unoriginate. and with absolutely simple essence.
So in other words, you're saying that you think that the Platonian doctrine, so Plotinus thinks that the one is completely simple. Okay, fine. And that this one means can only be one hypostasis in itself. It can't be three that have the nature of the one, if you could even speak of the nature of the one, which you probably can't for him. And Thomas wants to hold that same doctrine of divine simplicity, you say, but with...
but also tack on persons, correct.
I think that's inconsistent. Is that right?
Yes, it's the same philosophical Greek idea of what simplicity is. And then also the idea of let's also tack on persons. Let's use the Greeks insofar as they were good at talking about simplicity and the monad, and let's tack on three hypostases. And the argument is that given what's said in Greek and Hellenic thought generally that I'm talking about here about what simplicity is, there's no place for real distinctions in the persons. This is why it leads to modalism. This is why Aquinas is...
Do you want to get into Aquinas' Trinitarian theory then? Because that would be our next step. I'm still going to say, I would like to go back to the problem of whether or not you're willing to say that God has potency. So I'm going to take that as just bracketed for the moment. Do you want to go to Trinity instead?
I mean, if you listen to what I say, right? So when I said, yes, if you want to use your language and say, does God have potency? Then I would say, in the sense of him not having to create, but yet he chose to create, that is something that he actualized.
So this is just a verbal, that part is just a verbal distinction, right? So Aquinas constantly uses this distinction between active and passive potency. And the only kind which he's going to deny of God is passive potency, which is the kind of potency which the cup has.
We can cut past all this and just make it very clear that Aquinas says that all the distinctions in the attributes of God are notional. They're not real, that they're just conceptual distinctions that we make. And so God's love is the exact same as the essence, is the exact same as the foreknowledge, is the exact same as the act of creating. That's ultimately foolish.
Okay, I agree with the first part of the claim, right? So he does say that God's essence is the same as his act of loving himself, which is the same as his act of knowing himself, which is the same as his act of existence, which is the same as the act by which he makes all things.
And it's also the attributes that are the same as the essence of God.
Sure.
So
I'm
then you don't
we're talking about.
Ever know.
We're talking about active versus passive power, right? So obviously, right, God can make things that he hasn't made. But for Aquinas, that doesn't imply that God is, right, what we need to avoid is saying that God is receiving something or being actualized by something which he did not have to receive or be actualized by. Right? Does that make sense? Right. So what we're trying to do is exclude receptivity or passivity from the divine nature.
Right. I understand.
Is that a goal that you're okay with, or do I need to defend that one?
I don't think that any Orthodox person would say that God needed anything in his nature or anything like that.
So when I say that God doesn't have potency, that's just what I mean. Right, so the cup is in potency to this shape or that shape by virtue of its matter, and so it's being actualized by that, and so the cups needed some sort of shape. That's what we deny when we deny that God has potency in Aristotelian terms. If you like the word need better or open slot or whatever, that's fine. Same idea.
Okay.
So are we okay with that? Can we then agree that God doesn't have potency in that sense?
As far as I can tell, yes, that makes sense.
Okay. So that's all that we're trying to maintain when we hold that God is entirely simple. We don't want to be anything in God which would fill a slot.
That's not all that's
fill a need
right here. That's not all that's
that's our reason for holding it. Okay, so if you can show what you need to do, and this is what I tried to do in my own dissertation, right? So I'm arguing with you, but I'm actually at least half on your side. So if we can get to that part in a minute. But what you would need to do is to explain why the kind of multiplicity that you want doesn't involve actualizing or filling a need or an open slot or whatever in the divinity.
Yeah, I would just.
Does that make sense?
I would throw out all of these categories as not necessary.
Beg pardon?
I would throw out these categories as not necessary.
Well, surely, though, you're going to agree. No. Look, you can. What you can do is you can tell me that these things, right? So give me an example of multiplicity. Say the divine persons. You can say, and Aquinas will agree, of course, this multiplicity does not involve an actualization of the divine essence, and so we can allow it, right? But what you need to do is for every case of an energy that you describe, you need to explain to the Thomist why this doesn't count as, right? Why you don't need these categories, right? Why they don't apply. I think the onus is on you.
No, it's not, because first of all, there is 1,000 years of the church using categories and explanations and terms that are not Thomistic and are not Aristotelian. So we already have 1,000 years of this. So it's the onus is not on me, but actually on, and this, of course, you know, it was very controversial when Thomism began to adopt Aristotelianism. And ultimately, yes, it's not so much about this or that specific term, but it's about the almost scientific approach to dissecting God in this way, and not looking at how the revelation of what hypostasis is in the New Testament, or what energeia is, as opposed to physis in the New Testament.
Right. I don't know what you mean by scientific, right? What we've got is the data of revelation, right? We've got.
It's not data. It's not natural revelation as a science. Theology is not the queen of science. That's what I mean by scientific, right? Oh. It's about
seeking understanding. Yes,
it is, but that's
just what scientia means.
That understanding comes through the direct experience of God, not through the intellect.
Well, okay. So look, if you want to say that the only proper knowledge of God is by mystical vision, and then we're just wasting our time talking about him here, that's probably true.
No, the Orthodox believe in an analogia that's applicable to the energies, right? So the logoi, you read St. Maximus, the doctrine of the logoi, which he identifies as divine ideas, they're uncreated energies. They're not the essence of God. And so again, what you notice is that what distinguishes the Orthodox position consistently across the board, that's why I started out talking about how we have a different anthropology, we have a different triadology, we have a different doctrine of Christology, and a different eschatology, and a different ecclesiology, is because of the essence energy distinction and all these different points. So it's a whole system. It's holistic in our view.
I understand that, but so let me just try to plug in, since we're back to energies. Let's just try to plug in that term energy into the question I was asking you. All right, so what a Thomist is going to be worried about when he hears you talking about divine energies is the question of whether these energies would be such as to actualize the divine essence. I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you would want to say that, in fact, they don't actualize the divine essence, and that they're not received by, or that they're not principles of God's existence or God's nature at all.
Yeah, what I'm trying to tell you is that you have
anything in God. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, but what I've been trying to convey is that you have to reject Thomism, right? This whole system is a problem. So because you are trying to force me into the Aristotelian categories, I'm trying to tell you,
throw out any category. It's just this is not like Aristotle, right? To say that something can not, right, and that something's necessary or contingent. This is not Aristotle. This is just the basic. You were talking about
impotentia and actuality and actus
potency just means can be, right? It's what can be. That's all it is.
I know what contingency.
That's not Aristotle's copyright.
I know what contingency means. What I'm telling you is that you are a Thomist, and these categories that you're talking about did come from Aristotle, and they were introduced by, Thomas and his teacher, Albert Magnus. They were not the norm for the first 1,000 years of the church. Now, why weren't they the norm? Precisely because of
those terms. Obvious questions. We're not trying to have an argument about terms here, right? You're saying
in part we are, because we reject your doctrine of simplicity. Can you not see that the Hellenic doctrine of simplicity can be questioned?
Of course it can be questioned, but I'm saying that this doctrine of simplicity it can be questioned. I don't think that it can be successfully debunked. But
Okay,
what I'm saying.
For example,
The reason why.
So there's a whole 800-page book that debunks it, written by Saint Gregory.
There are lots of books that try to debunk it. That's neither here nor there.
He's a doctor of the church, and he shows that eunomianism is modalism based on his doctrine of simplicity. It's the exact same doctrine of simplicity.
Hold on, right? We're not here to just trade claims. You're wrong or you're wrong, right? We're here to try to evaluate arguments as best as we can, right? And so.
The argument is that Aquinas' doctrine of simplicity is the exact same as Eunomius' doctrine of simplicity. And although the conclusions are different, Eunomius is refuted in 800 pages by St. Gregory of Nyssa, and the whole argument is based on essence-energy distinction as well as other things.
Okay, so let me latch on to that then. How are you defining the divine simplicity doctrine, which you say Aquinas shares with Eunomius?
Well, I can look at the Summa under the questions like question 3, the simplicity of God, where it's stated very clearly in those 8 questions. I think he says, is God composite? Is he absolutely simple? Is God's existence the exact same as his essence? Yes, it is. Is there any accidents in God? No. Are all the attributes the same as the essence of God? Yes. Are they just logical distinctions? Yes. So forth and so on. I mean, there's not a whole lot of debate, I wouldn't think, about what Thomas says. Okay,
and so you're holding that Eunomius holds likewise that God is identical to anything that can be said of him, and therefore there can't be a Trinity.
The only difference between Aquinas and Eunomius is that Aquinas wants there to be a via negativa, and Eunomius didn't. You can fall on two sides of this coin. You can fall on the side of the coin with Aquinas where you want both things to be true, or you can fall on
both things are what? Trinity of persons and unity of nature?
Say what?
Where the two things are Trinity of persons and simplicity of nature?
What two things?
Has to hold both things at once. What two things? Simplicity of nature and Trinity of persons?
And a via negativa where we can predicate analogically of God.
I'm not sure that the via negativa issue is what's at stake here. So let me try. This may or may not.
This is why it's the exact same debate that St. Gregory had with Barliam. Barliam says that when we predicate of God, we predicate of him substantially, but analogically. And St. Gregory responds by saying, if God is an absolutely simple essence and you only know created effects, you don't actually know God. You don't actually know God because you never know whether you're experiencing what attribute, because all the attributes are identical to the divine essence.
Right. I mean,
you don't know if you're experiencing love. How do you know if you're experiencing love or justice or foreknowledge or what? You never know because they're all the same as the divine essence, and you don't ever participate in God. You only.
I'm happy to get into the problem of analogical predication, but I'm not sure that's the same problem.
It is.
Can we start with the Trinity for just a sec?
Sure.
Okay. So let me just try. Maybe this will, or maybe this won't be germane to the. To your point, but let me try to give Aquinas's defense. Right, so this is now the other side of the coin. It's not arguing for his position; it's repelling objections, explaining why he thinks that his doctrine of simplicity is compatible with the Trinity of persons. Right, because it seems to me that you're just saying it straight up. It's just a case of trying to have your cake and eat it too. Right.
Right. Correct.
Okay. So Aquinas's claim, with the way he holds divine simplicity to this extent, he doesn't want there to be anything in God which actualizes or is a principle of God's existence. Now, the reason why he thinks this is compatible with there being 3 subsistent relations in the divinity is because of how he understands the nature of relation in particular. Right, so this is more Aristotelian framework, bear with me. Right, so in his framework, all 10 of the categories are going to have 2 sides to them. Right? There's going to be the essay side, and there's going to be the form or the ratio side. Right? So you have dog nature, a substantial form, and you have the essay, which is proper to it, which is subsistent essay. And then you have quantity, there's this form, and then there's the essay, which is proper to it, which is in essay or inherence. And same for quality. And in the case of these 2, there's a double sort of inherence, according to Aquinas. So quantity inheres, this cup is big, let's say. Quantity inheres in its subject both in the sense that it draws its existence from that subject, right? Quantity doesn't just hang out on its own, and it's always the quantity of something. It inheres in that sense, and it adheres in a further sense, which is that it posits that content, that formal content in the subject, and makes that cup be 3 ounces, whatever. Right, so it serves now as a principle of that cup's being. It makes that cup be in a certain way. Okay, and same for quality. Right, so all the things that we normally think of as attributes or as accidents have this double inherence, that they exist in the subject, draw their existence from it, and they make it be in a certain way. So Aquinas is going to deny that there can be anything predicated of God, anything really distinct from God, inhering in him after the fashion of quantity or quality. And the reason is because quantity or quality inheres in that second way, and thus would, if really distinct from God, add something to God's being. Relation is different, according to Aquinas, because it doesn't do that. It inheres only in the first way. It's still got an essay, among creatures, but it doesn't make its subject, it doesn't add any new content to the subject. Right? So when you've got these 2 cups that are equal in size to each other, the size, right, that's in the category of quantity, posits content in the subject, actualizes it, modifies it. And based on the fact that it's got this thing which is modifying it, it's got this other feature, which is the relation of equality, which doesn't add anything to the cup at all. Doesn't make it, doesn't modify it, doesn't actualize it, doesn't limit it, nothing. So its ratio, according to Aquinas, is pure towardness, purely towards something else. Right, so that's just among creatures. Transposing this to God, he's going to say, okay, so like everything else in God, if our arguments for divine simplicity are right, the essay side of this accident is not going to be in essay. It's not going to be inherence. It's just going to be the self-same divine essay. But I can still talk about its ratio, its content, being distinct from other relations in God, because these relations, right, their towardsness is not towards the essence. They're not positing something in the essence. They're not modifying. They're strictly looking outward. And so I can say that God, the divine nature, is to, in the case of the Father, or from, in the case of the Son, without actualizing, modifying, limiting, or what have you, of the divine nature. And so for Aquinas, it's entirely principled to hold divine simplicity in the sense which I just stated, namely, there can be nothing in God which limits him or actualizes him, and at the same time to hold 3 subsistent relations in that divine nature. Right? So it's not ad hoc. It's not just we're going to tack it on. It has to do with what it means to talk about relations in the first place.
Yeah, I'm familiar with what he says, and the problem is that it doesn't work. So for one, the basic way to refute this is just to talk about the fact that this distinction is spoken of as relations of opposition, and yes, Aquinas does at times try to say that the Father is still the arche of the Trinity. But what he doesn't understand is that for the Eastern position, which has already defined this dogmatic. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hang on. I think I let you just say that again.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that this is already defined in Orthodox theology. We already had a way to understand the relations within the Trinity precisely because we didn't have the absolute divine simplicity doctrine. So we already had an Eastern tradition that dealt with these issues, particularly in St. Maximus Confessor, St. Photius, and so forth, who really fleshed this out on multiple levels. And that's because we don't have the absolute divine simplicity problem that we needed to even use relations of opposition. This does not come into play until Augustine, and then later on picked up by Anselm and Aquinas. So the problems with this idea and the way that you formulated it is that I understand that Aquinas doesn't want it to be just tacked on. He wants it to really be, 3 hypostases. But the problem is that when you get to this question of identifying the persons with the essence, which Aquinas is very dogmatic about, he says specifically that that nature is person. This goes contrary to the fact that St. John of Damascus on the Orthodox faith says very clearly that the identification of nature and person is the root of all heresies. And that's because St. John of Damascus understood that all the dialectical heretics would use this as this kind of dialectical relationship between thing and other, one and many, simplicity and differentiation. They always set up a dialectical tension. And so relations of opposition are ironically, or the Augustinian shield, is a way to define the persons dialectically. The problem is that it doesn't work. For one, the spirit is subordinate in this relationship because he doesn't have a property that the other two have. And in fact, in Roman Catholic dogma, it's actually stated more than once that the Father and the Son are together a co-cause of the Spirit. So the Father and the Son share a property that the Spirit doesn't have. All of this in order to maintain this system of how to differentiate between persons in an absolutely simple essence. Again, just toss out the absolutely simple essence doctrine of Aquinas, accept the Eastern doctrine, and you don't have this problem. The persons are differentiated because the Father is the arche, the unoriginate, the cause of the persons. The spiration is unique to the Spirit, generation is unique to the Son, and you don't need this relation of oppositions doctrine, which is a dialectical philosophical speculation approach, and actually doesn't really distinguish a person because, in fact, every one of the persons shares this relation of being not the other, right? Each of the persons is not the Son, is not the Spirit, is not the Father, etc. So not being the other two, and the Spirit not having a property of producing a person imbalances the Trinity. So the Spirit ends up being subordinate, and this is the chief reason why the East has a problem with the filioque. So what you're talking about in a way to distinguish the persons that doesn't do damage to divine simplicity, not only does it not work, it's actually the root of the filioque. The filioque was introduced precisely because of this question and these issues, and it just simply doesn't work.
All right. So first off, so I'm just going to reiterate my point about appeals to authority. So
you're in a Roman Catholic church.
No, I know. That's just
there are appeals to authority, namely Catholic.
Although I would have appreciated if you later email me the quotation you're thinking of.
Which one?
The one about the root of all heresies. That sounds fun.
Yeah, it's in On the Orthodox Faith. It's a famous quote where he's talking about Christology.
Yeah, but secondly, apart from all that, so first off, so do you want to go down the subordinationism thing? It's not clear to me, what you gain by, or how this problem is more your problem for me than it is for anybody, including for yourself. Because if you're going to say that subordinationism just means that one person is going to be subordinate to another in as much as it is from another, then
no, that's not
filioque or no filioque, then you've got a problem. Right. So
I said the Roman doctrine of the Father and the Son together sharing the property of being the co-cause of the Spirit subordinates the Spirit because the Father and the Son share a property that the Spirit does not. So in class, if you read John of Damascus or any of the Eastern Fathers, or what's normative even in some Catholic theology, they will make the claim that whenever we say something about God, the Trinity, it's either applicable to the persons or to the essence, right? So we're making a statement either about the unity of God or about the persons. There's no property that two persons share that another person doesn't have. And in filioquism, as it's defined in Florence and the Roman dogmas, you have the Father and the Son as the co-cause of the hypostasis of the Spirit. It's not just the eternal manifestation, which is what we believe about the Son sharing in the eternal manifestation of the Spirit. The Spirit rests in him. But in fact, in the Roman Catholic dogma, I don't think there's any question that it's the Father and the Son who are the hypostatic cause of the Spirit. So the subordination comes by the fact that the Father and the Son share a property that the Spirit does not.
Okay, so it's true that Aquinas will say this much, that there's four relations in God.
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be the relation of paternity, of filiation, of spiration, and of procession. And he holds that of those four, and maybe this is the aesthetic displeasure that you're having with this, Only three of those are, I forget what the technical term is, but only three of those correspond to a person. The reason is because the fourth, namely spiration, is not held in opposition, is not, well, it's held in common by two persons. And so it doesn't serve to identify one person as opposed to another.
Well,
but it's not clear.
He uses both. He uses relations of opposition, and he tries to use filiation, spiration, etc. So there's both are present in Aquinas, and it's only in the more radical filioquists that relations of opposition even entered as a way to do it, but it doesn't work. But there is a section where he talks about relations of opposition.
Oh yeah, no. Relations of opposition is central to Aquinas' theory. Right? Right. My point was just, sure, you have this aesthetic ugliness, if you like, that of the four relations with the two pairs, right? So paternity and filiation and procession to spiration. Only three of those pick out a person. And the reason is because the fourth, spiration, is shared in common by two. Of itself, I'm not sure why that's a problem. If you want to explain why
because the Father and the Son share a property that the Spirit does not. And anything that you say about God is applicable either to the persons or to the nature.
Okay, so by your theory, don't the Son and the Spirit both share a property which the Father does not?
No.
Being from?
No, because the way that they're defined is not merely being from. The way they're defined is hypostatic origin. So generation defines the Son, spiration defines the Spirit, and the Father is the sole cause.
Okay. And so, okay, but so it seems, so you see, trying to figure out where to start here. So it seems as though I could say in reply, right? So what you've got there is they both share this property of being from, and one of them is from in this way, which is being generated, sonship, and one of them is being from in this way, which is being spirated or proceeding or whatever. But it seems as though I can say the exact same thing with regards to spiration, right? Because I can say that the Son spirates the Spirit as from the Father, and I can say that the Father spirates the Spirit not as from. And so, although sure, there's a verbal similarity at the level of abstraction, the reality is there's no like actual real relation which Father and Son both have, which the Spirit doesn't.
But in the Roman dogma, they're defined as a co-cause. Father and Son are hypostatically.
No person is caused by any other.
Of course they are.
Cause? The cause means to receive being. I don't think you want to say that.
This is typical Orthodox and Church Father terminology. The Father is the sole cause. Even Aquinas uses this terminology.
Right. So again, it just depends on what you mean by cause, right? So if by cause you mean something which makes something else, obviously not. Normally when we...
It's in your own dogmas that the Father and the Son are the co-cause of the Spirit's hypostasis.
Yeah. If you want to send me footnotes,
you want me to read the dogma? Do you want me to read the dogma to you?
No. Just go ahead and send me the footnote. But what I'm trying to do right now is just defend Aquinas' position as I understand it. And to my knowledge, he's never going to say that the Father causes the Son. He's going to say that the Father generates the Son. He's going to say that the Son has the divine nature as from the Father. He's very precise in his terminology, and I think he tries to avoid cause for a reason.
When the term cause is used, they don't mean it in the sense of creating. It's just a terminology.
Insofar as it's used as synonymous for X is from Y, that's fine.
Well, that's how it's used patristically. So they're not saying, and many church fathers use this terminology. Again, it's in Florence. The Father and the Son are a co-cause. I'm looking for the other. I think it's Lateran. It talks about. I'll give you the Denzinger here in a second, but again, the point is that you have a balanced position in the East where you don't have attributes or properties that two have, and saying from a source is not an attribute. Because it's not a positive relation, it's a negative relation that doesn't express anything. That's part of that relation of opposition. we don't do relations of opposition. We do hypostatic origin as the way to understand the Trinity. And since the Father alone is the sole cause or arche of the Trinity, he's the unoriginate one. The only way to distinguish the persons is by hypostatic origins, by the fact that the Son is generated and the Spirit eternally proceeds.
Right, but
so,
how do you distinguish what it means to be generated and what it means to proceed?
I will tell you what every single Eastern Father says to that very question, which is that we don't know what those words mean.
Okay.
It is revealed.
One can't throw in the towel that way. But what Aquinas is trying to do is to give a principled reason for why these two should not collapse into each other, right? And it seems as though that's something valuable to do. Just to go back to the subordinationism thing again, it's just not clear to me. It's not clear to me why, by saying that the Father is strictly two, by saying that the Son is both from and to, and saying that the Spirit is strictly from, it's not clear to me why I am saying that one of these is like better or nobler or higher than the other, right? Because and Aquinas does discuss this objection, and his point is simply that when you're talking about nobility, the nobility comes strictly from the divine essence. That's something absolute, and that's shared equally by all. To speak of from and to or from and to is not to speak in the language of better or worse or primary or secondary.
The idea of subordination doesn't have to do necessarily with just defining what is lesser or more noble.
So what do you mean by what is it that you see as the problem with what you're calling subordination, and how do you define it?
That again, in our triadology, which I again would argue is from the Eastern Fathers and Councils, and not just like my speculation, our triadology doesn't argue that that we can say anything about God that isn't applicable to hypostasis or to God considered as unity, right? To one God. So if we say wisdom is a property or attribute that is applicable to all the persons, right? So it's not like the Father alone has wisdom and the Spirit doesn't, right? So that's a statement about God considered as God. It's applicable to all the persons because wisdom is wisdom is a natural attribute. It's a property or an attribute applicable to nature. So likewise, when we say that we consider the will of God, does God have three wills or one will? God has one will because will is a property of nature and not a property of hypostasis. And for us, this is applicable to anything that's said about God. So when we talk about Trinitarian relations, when we talk about how we distinguish the persons, we distinguish them by their origin, by the fact that the Father alone is the soul. The fact that you have a problem with the Father being called sole arche or cause, I think shows a lack of understanding of what the Eastern Fathers say when they define the Father as the cause. So for us, hold on.
What you mean by cause is just, I think, what I meant by saying from and to. We're just talking about the relations of origin, and that's fine.
Okay, but for us, it's not just a question of like speculating about the Trinity. For us, this is how we know God. God is known first and foremost, as Paul says, one Father. So God reveals himself to us hypostatically or personally. We don't start with reasoning back and coming up with a first cause simple essence. We start with the fact that God says, I am he. God is personal.
Sure.
Our ordo theology is different. Our ordo theology, right? We start with the Father. And the Father as the sole cause or arche, A-R-C-H-E in the Greek, as Basil uses it, is the cause of the Son in terms of generation, and he's the cause of the Spirit eternally in terms of spiration. And so that alone is the way that we distinguish the persons. There's no other way. So anytime we make a statement about God, when we say, how do we know who the Spirit is? We say he proceeds eternally from the Father through the Son. Mm-hmm. When we say, who is the Son? He is eternally generated from the Father and eternally manifests the Spirit, right? So those are the ways that we distinguish. And anything said about God in our Trinitarian theology causes imbalance if we attribute a property, a positive property, to two persons that one of them doesn't have. The Spirit, therefore, lacks in the ability to produce a person. And this, and in other words, the Father and the Son have this melded kind of co-cause here, to use the terminology of Florence, and I think the Lateran Council. Again, I'm going from memory here, but it is a Father and the Son together signify a single principle of the Spirit, to use the terminology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the reason I'm having trouble with this argument is that it's just not clear to me what is so dire about the saying that this,
because nothing that's said of God
doesn't produce in this.
When you say things about God, it's
toward a new person. The others too. The other two are, because you're happy with saying
no, because you can verify. You can see the subordination of the Spirit in the Roman Church over the last several hundred years. The Spirit is not given his proper role, and this is why you think that, I'm not trying to get off on a trail, but the Roman Church thinks that you need the papacy to settle all issues, because the idea of Pentecost actually guiding, the Spirit guiding the actual churches is suppressed. It leads to the idea of why we need a pope, because you don't understand the meaning of Pentecost and the reality of the Spirit. The Spirit is just as divine. He's not lacking in the ability.
You don't need to convince me that the Holy Spirit is divine. All I'm doing is would want to deny firmly that being toward another person as towards rather than from is somehow essential to being a divine person. I don't think
he doesn't produce a person.
I do think that following down the filioque trail is a bit of a rabbit hole at the moment, right? So
it relates to divine. Filioque is a result of absolute.
I understand that. So you're saying that it's this clinching argument against divine simplicity, that divine simplicity entails the filioque, and the filioque is bunk, and that's not going to work for me, because I don't think the filioque is bunk, and thus it seems perfectly legit to hold divine simplicity. So if you want to argue against the argument that I was giving before,
the Father and the Son are a co-cause or a co-principle together. Of the Spirit does not have this property of producing a person.
Yeah,
so that is subordination. So he's lacking in a property that the other two share.
Yeah, but I mean, you could say the same thing about right? So I don't see why that's any more problematic.
Because the classical dogma, because
the Father is. That doesn't mean that the Father is better.
No, you're not getting the point that for the first 1,000 years, it was normative to say that anything that we say about God is applicable to either the persons, all of them, or to the nature, or to them individually. So there can't be something that two share that one doesn't. That produces the imbalance. There's only one cause.
I'm not seeing the connection between those two claims. And I'm also not sure why you want to say that everything which is predicated.
There's only one arche in the Trinity, and it is the Father. And the Son does not share in his arche, in his hypostatic property. Filioquism makes the Son share in what makes the Father distinct, namely being the unoriginate cause of the Godhead.
Yeah, so I mean, and you're not going to like this, right? But the Thomistic answer to that part of the problem is going to be what makes the Father be the Father, right, is the generating of the Son in the act of knowledge, which is this dyadic thing. And then what makes the Holy Spirit be the Holy Spirit is the fact that it results from the love of the two, right? So again,
this is why you use the same argument that the Arians used, that the Holy Spirit is a product of the will of the Father and the Son. This is also the exact same argument.
I'm aware that you don't like the psychological analogy, but again, can we keep the
because this is important. Listen, Saint Gregory Palamas uses the psychological analogy, but he applies it to eternal manifestation. And when he critiques the filioque, he says the Romans are confused because they mistake mission for hypostatic origin, and they also mistake eternal manifestation for hypostatic origin. So that's why I began the talk when I mentioned St. John of Damascus talking about eternal manifestation of the Spirit. It's not hypostatic origin. It's John of Damascus who makes that point and that distinction in on the Orthodox.
Sorry, what's not hypostatic origin? What's not hypostatic origin?
What we were just talking about with the Holy Spirit, the psychological analogy that you used, right? This is from Augustine, and it's in.
Yeah. You're saying that it's not the hypostatic origin. That's a claim. I deny it. What's your argument?
Because it doesn't work, because the Son takes on a property of the Son takes on the very thing that defines the Father, which is to be the sole arche of the Trinity.
Well, no, what defines the Father is to, according to Aquinas, is to be innascibilis, right? To not be from. What defines
That's relations of opposition, and I said earlier that doesn't work because the other two are not from, which you admitted.
I can go over the text again. Let's see. But okay, we can keep on going down the Filioque trail if you like.
Well, no, let's put it this way. If you read on the Orthodox faith, which of course Aquinas, references many times, you will find that everything that I'm saying and claiming is 100% in line with what St. John Damascus is arguing. And my point is just to say that
may or may not be. That's not really my concern, but okay, go ahead.
I'm telling you to read it because you'll find my arguments are all from that and other Orthodox writers. So I'm not making arguments that are like out of my head. They're actually from maybe somebody that you would find worth reading, useful, right? For the sake of future dialogue, I'm saying if you read that, you'll see all my arguments are there.
I would happily take the opportunity to read St. John Damascene.
And the Roman Church affirms that, right? So
affirms what?
He's a doctor of the church, and Aquinas.
I mean, to affirm that somebody's a doctor of the church is not to affirm everything that they say is true, of course. But
I'm not saying that it's true because it said it. I'm saying that the arguments are there, and for future reference, you would, if you want to understand where I'm getting all this, it's from there.
Sure. Well, no, I appreciate that. But again, so just to recap what got us there, right? So you're saying that divine simplicity is irreconcilable with the Trinity because the only way that you can reconcile it with the Trinity is by subordinationism. I'm not convinced. We can keep on having that argument if you think that's the linchpin.
Do you understand what I'm saying, though? Well, the problem is that you don't understand our position in terms of hypostatic origins as the only way to explain who God is. I mean, even the idea of the Father being the arche or cause is foreign to you, and it's common in the Eastern Fathers.
I think you just said it was inexplicable, right? Because I asked you what procession means as distinct from filiation, and you said that that's in principle unanswerable.
And that's the answer of all the Eastern Fathers. Even Augustine says that we don't even know exactly what these words mean. We have to.
I don't know exactly what these words mean, but I'm asking you to give me some way in which, in an imperfect, crucial way, we can distinguish these things. I mean,
well, he even says we don't know how to define it. We don't know how to define procession. We don't know how to define eternal generation, and why these two things are different, but they are. And if you read the next several hundred centuries after Augustine of debate on this very question, what you come to find out is that the way that we distinguish the persons is different from the way Rome tries to do it. Rome tries to do it within a context of also accepting absolute divine simplicity. We don't. And because we don't, we have the Father defined by his role as arche or sole origin or cause of the Godhead. That means that for him to retain his hypostasis, he doesn't share that property of being the cause with anyone else. So that's why the Son can't take on. Listen, that's why the Son can't take on what is his defining hypostatic term.
I understand that. And the issue is that we're taking two different things as being the defining note of the Father, right? So I'm looking right now at De Potentia 9:9. Which is on whether there are only three persons in God.
Hello? Hello? Well, it looks like we lost. Hello?
Being not born. Are you there? My computer's having some issues.
Cut out the server.
Yeah, so I'm looking right now at De Potentia 9:9, which I think is Aquinas' fullest explanation of how he thinks the three persons are distinguished from each other. Mm-hmm. Could be wrong about that. But so what he takes as the defining attribute of the Father is not being cause of the others, which is what you are taking as that, right? So I grant you, right? If you're going to say that being the cause of another person is what defines the Father, then the Father and the Son would collapse into each other on the Filioque view, right?
Correct. The Son would
but
share.
his view is that that's not what defines the Father. Rather, what defines the Father is being innascibilis, which in other words means to not be born, right? So to not be from a cause. And that's not true of either Father or Son. And so it seems as though that problem that you were just worried about just depends on what you choose as the
No,
defining attribute.
I recognize that Aquinas has a place for giving the Father that role. That's not what the contention is. The contention is that when we see that as the Father's only main defining property, that the Son can't.
What was that? Being innascibilis or being the cause of another?
That he is unoriginate and the sole cause of Godhead. This is again the classical terminology of who the Father is in Basil and Gregory Nazianzus and Gregory Nyssa, and in the councils. That can't be something that the Son shares in. Okay, and the Son shares in that if he becomes also the cause of the Spirit. There's
I understand that, but it's just a question of what you take as a defining attribute of the Father, right? So if you take the defining attribute of the Father as being the cause of a person, more cause, I mean like the originating toward, then there would be two fathers, and that's what you're trying to avoid. But if you simply take the Father to be that which does not proceed, which is not from another, then there's only one, and I'm not sure what the problem is.
That's just another way of saying that he is the sole cause of the Godhead. He's not from another. Okay, the other two are from another, right? So this is relations of opposition. And again, I'm trying to tell you that that doesn't work as a negative definition of who these people are, or who the hypostases are.
These persons, yes. Again, I'm not sure what I lose by saying that he is that which is, by taking the Father as that which is who gives and does not receive, taking the Son as he who gives and receives, and taking the Holy Spirit as he who receives. Right? That seems to distinguish all three quite nicely. You can say, if you like, that receiving is common to Son and Spirit. You can say, if you like, that giving is common to Father and Son. But these are different kinds of giving and they're different kinds of receiving, just like you said.
Right. So Aquinas talks about, sometimes the Roman Catholic Church will talk about the Father as the principal source of the Godhead, and then the Son as a secondary source when we talk about the spiration. And what we say is that that's impossible because, number one, the Son can't participate in the Father's hypostasis, and number two, it gives two persons a positive property that the Spirit doesn't have.
So I get what you're saying, but I'm just going to repeat what I was saying, which is, I don't think let me say it a different way. I don't think I'm giving any of the persons a real positive property, something which exists.
The Father and the Son produce the Spirit.
Yes. Right. This is the commonistic predication.
That's a real positive property that the Spirit doesn't have.
So maybe this is getting into the problems of divine predication, or just problems of predication in general. So what Aquinas is going to claim is that not all of just the fact that you can use the same word for something doesn't mean that there is, in both cases, the same reality corresponding isomorphically to your word. Right. So Aquinas isn't going to say that there's two relations in the Father, one to the Son and one to the Spirit. Right, because that would mean that the Father was two subsistent. So what you've got in the case of the Father is one relation, which is not from and toward, period. And what you've got in the Son is a relation of from and toward, right? Received, giving. And what you've got in the Holy Spirit is a relation of reception. There's no real thing which is shared. Although I can speak of the Son and Spirit as receiving.
You don't think the Father and the Son really produce the Spirit?
Do you say that the Son and the Holy Spirit really receive the Father?
We don't use any of this gobbledygook because we don't believe Thomism, but we have a way of distinguishing all these.
I'm just saying that receiving is as much of a positive predicate as giving, and whether or not you have
No, it's not,
that.
because you affirm hypostatic origin, supposedly Roman Catholics do, supposedly Aquinas does, and for the Spirit it is said to be from the Father and the Son as a single principle. There's no single principle in God that two persons share that the other one doesn't. It's a very simple argument.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that, right? I'm saying that there is no metaphysical reality which Father has, or which Father and Son both are.
Yes, there is.
Right?
Your councils say together they constitute a single principle of the spiration of the Spirit in terms of his hypostatic origin. So that directly refutes the claim.
No, because we don't say that there is no act of causing, right? There's relations of toward and there's relations of from. The standard Thomistic model in this, right, is that you have.
Well, you can throw out the word cause, and you can just say he's the principal source. The Father and the Son in the Roman Catholic dogmas are said to be together a single source of the hypostasis of the Spirit.
I'm okay with that.
That is directly what you said.
Saying that there's a what's it, right? A property like whiteness or greenness or a relation or whatever, which is real in both Father and Son. Right? Again, just as you would not want to say that simply the fact that both Son and Spirit are from or are proceed, let's say, from the Father. You're willing to say that, right? That both Father and Son proceed from the Father?
No, absolutely not. Because proceed is in the Greek, the ekparousis is a specific term that defines who the Spirit is, and generation is specific to who the Son is.
Okay. So is there a word you would like to use?
We don't use these common attributes of, well, both are from another, right? We don't do relations of opposition.
Look, that's fine by me if you want to say that this. So you're talking about cause, right? So you're using this word cause, yes? Father causes, quote unquote.
The fathers and the councils use this term of the Father.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But you're going with that, right? Okay. Is there a correlative to
that
cause?
Shows, by the way, they don't use the Aristotelian Thomistic view of this.
That's fine. Are you going to grant that there is a correlative to cause, which is being caused?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, are you going to grant correlative is?
It is true to say. It is. Listen. It is true to say that the Son and the Spirit are from another. That's true. That's fine. All we're saying is that is not what defines the persons and lets us know the distinctions of the hypostasis.
Right, but simply being to another is not what defines the persons in Thomistic theology either. What defines the Father is to another and not from.
But you again, I understand that.
It's not supposed to be two.
But the whole dogma interjects a new principle into the Trinity of the Father and the Son together constituting a single hypostatic source of the Spirit. So you have a new principle of a dyad introduced into the Trinity, and there is no dyad. It's always whatever's true is true of the persons or of God as a whole. That's straight up classic Orthodox Trinitarianism. And I'm saying Orthodox in the general sense.
Yeah, look, I don't. Where do I want to? I'm trying to think of a way to say this without just repeating myself again.
You're admitting hypostatic properties and causes or origins. We can throw out cause.
Origins. That's standard Thomistic Trinitarian theology.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the origin of the Spirit is from a Father and Son as one principle. Correct?
My knowledge of Aquinas' Trinitarian theology is not sufficient to allow me to say yes to the as from principle.
It's in Roman Dogma.
May or may not be. I would have to check.
He does say that, if I recall, but I don't have the sumo on hand. So, but anyway, I don't think we're going to have to maybe.
I would be really hesitant to say that. I would be surprised.
That's the dogmatic filioque teaching.
Yeah. But I would be surprised if he thinks of Father and Son as together doing one. What's it? Again. There is no action which is coming out of either one of them, right? In this theology, there's just relations of to and from. So again, there's no like source of, right. So you're talking about a dyad being like a,
yeah. Well, again, the reason that
converging arrows producing a third thing, and I just think that's the wrong way to think about this.
No, it's not the wrong way. It's the right way, because that's how the Eastern Fathers all categorize it, and that's how it's used, not just in the councils, but also when it comes to Christology.
No, I'm saying that that's the wrong way to understand what Aquinas is saying. But
anyway,
yeah. So,
do we want to maybe move to a different topic?
Okay. So, what's that?
Do we want to move on? I mean, we're just going to keep going, I think, in circles about this, because
yeah, no, so maybe reading St. John Damascene is going to convince me that the Filioque is so bad that it's this tremendous roadblock to any divine simplicity theory. But at the moment, it seems to me that being able to, like, I'm not feeling the problem of saying that both Father and Son can be said to spirate, because again, this does not name a real relation according to Aquinas. And so, like, I'm not moved, maybe I should. I would only be moved by it at the moment if to spirate were said to be a real relation defining a person for Aquinas. That would be inconsistent. Aquinas does not hold that. But okay, so let me just let's backpedal from this. Can I ask you another question about the energies?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the central problem, like I was saying earlier, that a Thomist is going to have with talking about energies is if energies are in some way going to be positing something in the subject, right? So regular accidents like wisdom and justice, right? So when I say that I have these, right, they are from me, right? They exist in me, but they also posit something in me. They make me be a certain way, right? So if we were to take energies in that sense, the Thomist is going to be very worried, right? Because it's going to seem as though you're filling a slot or an opening or something in God that the divine nature of itself doesn't have. Now, I presume that's not what you're saying, right? Do you want to characterize how your understanding of energies avoids that? How is predicating wisdom as an energy of God different from predicating wisdom as an accident of me?
Because we don't identify, this is the point I was making earlier about analogical predication, we don't identify the predicates with the divine essence, which then makes them meaningless. We say that the predicates are analogical to the energies, which are not the divine essence.
That didn't answer my question.
It does answer your question, because what you're talking about with you is actually an argument that Nissa uses when he says that how do we understand the difference between act or energy and will and nature and person. He says, well, let's look at a human person, right? There's an action that's distinct from the person. If a person builds a house, that's an effect of the work that he did. We might learn something about that person, but we don't perceive his nature or directly know his hypostasis by looking at the house that he built. We might learn a few things about him. When we interact with that person directly, we interact with his hypostasis, which is what makes him distinct. And we understand that perhaps we share a common nature between me and so Mr. Dr. Feingold, have a human nature that I share, but I'm the hypostasis, Jay. You're the hypostasis, Dr. Feingold. So that's now. So the Eastern Fathers make these analogies, right, to who God is, and they say that in the same way that a man creates a building, and we might learn about him and his wisdom and his works that are proper to human nature through creating a house. In the same way, there's an analogy to God creating the world. His energy and act of creating the world is distinct from who he is in his essence, because if we said that the act of creating the world was the same as the divine essence, we would be led to all kinds of absurdities, such as that the creation of the world is exactly the same as the conflagration, because both are divine actions. So what we say is that the energies of God are the things around him. This is the way that St. Dionysius the Areopagite, this is the way St. Basil, St. Gregory, St. Nyssa, they all say that it's the way to understand this is to look at when Moses goes up on the mountain, and we're told in Exodus that Moses saw God face to face, but no man can see God face to face and live. So how is this possible? Well, it's possible because the theophanies, the manifestations of God, the energies of God within history that operate, can at times even be made visible if God so chooses to.
Right. So, I mean, all of that you're describing is completely compatible with what Aquinas says about divine simplicity, right?
No, it's not at all.
Sure it is, because Aquinas absolutely maintains
the theophanies are not real in your doctrine.
I don't know what you mean by that. So
you don't believe that God's goodness was manifest distinct from the essence of God. Moses didn't see the essence of God.
The manifestations of God's goodness are distinct from the essence of God, right? So look,
only because you believe they're created effects, though. You don't believe that it's actually the goodness of God. You believe that it's a created hologram or effect of God. This is why Roman Catholicism tends to not believe that the angel of the Lord it was the pre-incarnate logos, because that's impossible in absolute divine simplicity.
Seems to me that you're trying to hold two incompatible things. So let me try to parse this out.
No, I'm telling you that our view is revealed, right? The theophanies are the logos pre-incarnate.
Hold on.
One person can become manifest within time and space.
Yes, I know that the person become manifest in time and space, but look,
you don't believe that.
Sure I do.
No, you don't. You don't believe that the angel of the Lord was the logos. The Roman Catholic doctrine is that those are created holograms and not Christ himself. That's why you believe that the light of Mount Tabor is created light.
Well, let's rewind a little bit. Okay, so and we can talk about how to make sense.
I have never met a Roman Catholic who believes that the theophanies were real, or that the light of Matthew 17, the Transfiguration, was uncreated light. Every Roman Catholic I've ever met.
Yeah, no, but you've said
every doctrine I've ever read is all.
The thing that I was saying Aquinas agrees with 100% is what you said at the beginning, which is that these things which you are calling energies are not attributes of God in the sense of things that modify him or exist in him distinct from his essence, but rather they're things that show up in his works.
St. Basil and St. Gregory Nyssa use the analogy of the sun and its heat and its rays.
That's the part that Aquinas agree. Mm-hmm.
Right. So the sun, the heat, and its rays can be genuinely distinguished, but they're not exactly the same. We don't believe that the foreknowledge of God is exactly the same as the wisdom of God or the love of God or the justice of God. Like equating the foreknowledge of God with the justice of God makes no sense.
Okay, so this is, I want to get into that argument in a minute. Okay, and quick question, so I know how to pace myself for what's left. How much time do we have left on this?
I probably need to go pretty soon. We can set up like a part 2 though.
If you want.
But
sure.
We've been going for, how long have we been going?
It's been hour and 50 minutes, I think.
Okay, so let's say 2 hours, and then maybe we can pick up at a part 2 if you want to do it.
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, so the thing which I was trying to get at with the energy thing, right? So what Aquinas wants to deny, and which I would want to deny with him, is that, let's you picked justice and foreknowledge, so let's go with that. All right, he would want to deny that these things taken and manifested in the world, right? So let's say the justice of the damnation of sinners, or the justice or the foreknowledge manifested in prophecy or whatever, right? He would want to deny that these manifestations are attributes existing in God in the way in which I described quantities and qualities as existing in their subjects. Right? Does that make sense? In other words, they don't posit what you just described, and what Aquinas is holding with divine simplicity is the same in this respect. Neither of you, it seems to me, want to say that there is something in God distinct from the essence, which is nonetheless makes God be a certain way. Can we agree about that?
As far as I understand your meaning, I'm not sure what you mean.
There's no, so in my soul, there's a little doohickey, if you like, the virtue of justice, which I wasn't born with, right? It doesn't come with my soul. Please God, I've acquired a little bit of it over the course of the last 30 years. And it makes me be in a certain way, right? And it's distinct from me, right? That's not what you mean by energies, right? What you mean by energy in my case would be something like, I do something just, right? And that shows you.
Correct. Most of the time, for example, in the New
what
Testament,
you actually see is my just action. Am I getting that right?
Correct. For example, in the New Testament, when energeia is used, it's for example when Paul talks about the operations of the Spirit, right? So the energy of the Spirit is when he's talking about like the gifts of the Spirit. So when the Spirit grants prophecy, when he grants mercy to different gifts to the saints, the charismatic gifts. I don't mean charismaticism, you know what I mean. The word that's used there is energeia, which just signifies divine operations or actions.
Yeah.
And sometimes, yes, we would say that if you're talking about the attributes, the love of God, we believe that is an energy. And we even believe that the knowledge that we have that God's essence is one is also an energetic truth that we learn through divine revelation.
Yeah.
It's not something that we,
So if I'm trying to make sense of what you're saying and transporting it into my categories, I think I can assent to a lot of it, but it's going to sound like this. So tell me if you've got problems with this translation. So it seems as though you want to say that the energy can refer to, when I speak of the energy of God's justice or of his unity or whatever, what you mean is not that there is an attribute distinct from the divine essence, which inheres in the divine essence, but rather one of two things. And maybe you think these are the same thing. They don't sound the same to me. Thing one would be there's a work done in creation which manifests that which I'm calling God's justice, right? So that would be like the punishment of this sinner. And the other one would be the content which I am predicating of God, right? So when I say, right, so you've got thing one, that's this thing which happened right here, the sinner got punished. And then there's thing two, which is as a result of seeing this, I predicate this concept that I have of justice of God. And I don't want to say that this concept that I have of justice is like a concept of God, but I do want to say that I can predicate it of him. And so because you want to, on the one hand, deny that what I've got in my mind of justice equals God, but on the other hand, you want to affirm that it gets to God somehow, you call this an energy. And this is an energy in a different sense from the actual work of damning the sinner. Does that all sound fair so far?
Well, I laid out three distinctions at the beginning where I was talking about the energies of God as relating to eternal manifestation, the energies of God relating to creation, and then some energies that...
Let's just stick with things like justice and foreknowledge for the moment.
Well, there's a sense in which, I mean, you could say God is eternal.
That's where I wanted this double distinction to show up.
Okay, well, you can
leaving aside like Trinitarian stuff and leaving aside hypostatic union stuff and all that.
Well, but I want to stress that for us, all these things are related because you're not going to have the essence energy distinction without the proper doctrine of the Father as the arche and the right ordo theologiae. So it's not like these things operate in discrete from the other doctrines. They all hang or fall together.
I'll bear that in mind. And so tell me if I'm if my lumping things, or if my if I'm saying something which would be corrected by bringing in some of the other sides. So what Aquinas would want to say, right? So in this case of understanding, seeing God's justice and predicating it of him, right? We would deny that there is a what's it, which is up there in God, which is distinct from God's essence, to which I am referring when I say that God is just. What he would affirm is that there are three things involved. There is the action, which is just. There is my concept of justice. And there is the divine essence, which bears some sort of resemblance to my concept.
Yeah, but it doesn't. And that's the whole point, because the things in your head are particular and they're discrete and they're related to things in time and space and history. And the absolutely simple essence, which is supposedly identical to divine justice, God's justice, there's no way to know that that's what you're experiencing or bridging that gap, because all you know is created effects.
Right. So, but that's true of, and this isn't just true of God, right? So we know all things through their operations, right? I don't have any direct access to you, right? I have access to you only through your operation of talking, right?
That's how you and I know each other. But it's not just created effects in terms of knowing God. In terms of knowing God, it's beyond created effects. That was what was true generally for the Old Testament period, signs and symbols. Now we see Now we see Christ face to face, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3.
Mm-hmm. No, that's right.
No, you believe in the beatific vision. You don't believe we see Christ face to face.
I believe that what it means to say that I see Christ face to face now is different from what it means to see Christ face to face in the beatific vision, if that's what you mean.
Right, because now it's only created effects.
Yeah, so we're mixing issues again, I think.
How do you know you're seeing the justice?
One of the things that
how do you know that it's the justice
what
of
it
God?
means to share in the divine life, and I know that this is big for Palamas in the original.
How do you know that it's the justice of God and not the foreknowledge or love of God that you're experiencing?
So Aquinas would say, depending on what you mean by that, that's
well, I think it matters whether I'm under God's justice,
right?
And
so like, if you're talking, like, hold on, if you're talking about, right? So I can say this action, right? So let's say that this action here seems to exemplify God's mercy or whatever, right? So the sinner gets failed like 20 times and gets this new huge influx of grace and conversion. Okay. What is it that allows me to say that the name mercy is most applicable to this situation? It would be because what I see of this situation most maps with my creaturely concept of mercy. But to say that
your creaturely concepts are analogous, right, to something that is completely unlike the things that you think you have. Like, in other words, the divine justice is not like human justice, right?
Of course. I'm willing to object to completely unlike, of course, but
so it's analogous. It's an analogy, but the thing that you're making an analogy to is absolutely simple.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. And all the predicates are actually identified.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know that you're actually experiencing one or the other? Because they're not really distinct.
Right. So it depends on what you mean by what you're experiencing, right? If you're saying that I'm experiencing God, right? So like, if you're asking which part of God I'm experiencing,
I'm saying that Thomism is
not experiencing any part of God because God doesn't have parts. But if you're asking why am I applying this name to this manifestation, it's because this manifestation captures more of this concept that I have than of that concept. Yeah, I don't see a problem there.
There's no bridge between the concept and the thing. There's no bridge between the concept and the absolutely simple essence. You never know that actual thing. You only know created effects, and you don't. You don't know if your created effects match up to this thing. How can they?
So
this is why Palamas calls it atheism.
Yeah. So I'm not going to say. Repeat what you said right before that last thing.
All that you experience in your life are the created effects of this super monad essence. You never experienced a direct example of God himself or God's justice within time and space. You only experience created effects of God. And so when you talk about the love of God or the foreknowledge of God or the mercy of God, you're not actually talking about something that you know that you've experienced. You're only talking about a creaturely analog that you hope matches up to this absolutely simple essence, wherein all of the attributes are the exact same. So it's meaningless.
The problem is that I think we're using talk about in two different senses, right? So there's
the via negativity doesn't work if absolute divine simplicity is true. That's the crux of the argument. Because all of the things that you're talking about are not like an absolutely simple essence. One creaturely effect is you're just interpreting a creaturely effect compared to some other creaturely effect.
Yeah, so trying to figure out where to start here again. Right, so look, I just disagree with your claim, and then I'll see if I can give a principled reason for disagreeing with it. I just disagree with the claim that if X is limited and Y is infinite and per se rather than participated, that it follows that that there is no similarity whatsoever between X and Y.
All you know is created effects, and you never know that thing itself, so you have no referent for it.
Yeah. So look, when I say, let's try to give concrete examples, right? So
that is the analogia entis, right?
Well, I'm not quite sure how you're using these words. So let's just try to give concrete examples, and let's see where we part ways.
The analogia entis in Aquinas, the analogy of being, right, is that we can look at the world, we can see being, We can predicate that God is the super being, but of course he doesn't have being in the exact same way as everything else has being, because the being in this world is composite, it's caused. The being that God has is the super being that's uncaused and not composite, right? So there's an assumption of analogy, right? And we're not using univocal predication, we're using analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So,
right. I mean, the idea is that it's supposed to be the same thing signified, but different mode of signification. And that's your classic line. Right, so let me just try to give an example. So when I say that you are loving or whatever, right? So I don't have access to the habit of love, which is in your soul. But I do have access to the actions by which you work for the good of others, right? And so on the basis of your doing these actions, I predicate love of you, where love means that in you by virtue of which you will the good for others, and you seek their good, right? So, and in us, that by which you will and you seek work for the good of others is this extra little habit which is added onto your soul and which is different from the habit of wisdom, as evidenced by the fact that you can have one without the other.
We just don't use these categories.
I'm just trying to explain what Aquinas means by this. Okay. And so when I talk about God's having love, it would be the same sort of deal in this respect. Right? I don't have access to God's love. I don't see inside his essence. What I have access to, just like you said, are these manifestations. I see God becoming man and dying on the cross for us.
Created effects.
Hang on, I'm not quite done yet. And because of this, right? So when I say that God has love or is love, what I mean is that there is in God that by which he does this act, which is seeking the good of others. It's just that in this case, that by which he does this operation is not an extra little which is added onto him. It's just him, and I can't fathom that. But that's what it means. That's why I predicate the same word of me and of you and of God.
Yeah, analogical.
Like the categories, that's fine. But I'm just trying to make sense of what we're saying, like why we think that it makes sense to apply the term loving, let's say, to God.
But you're only looking at created analogs, and none of those things are the thing itself. So you don't actually know that God has love.
Well, do I know that you have love?
Yeah, but knowing that I have love doesn't mean that you know God has love. Because
no. How do I know that you have
another
love?
Created effect.
How do I know that you have love?
Because you have a personal interaction with me, and in your doctrine, it's not.
No. Do I have to have a personal interaction with you to know that you have love?
Well, you might hear secondhand from somebody, but the point is that we're talking about God himself, right?
Well, no, but I'm saying that both of these things, right? So it can be, right? So in case of you and me, right, it can be the case that I see you doing something good to another, or I can see you doing something good to me, like taking these 2 hours out of your day to talk to me.
Right.
And both of these allow me to predicate of you something which I don't directly see.
But how do you know that is God showing love to you?
As opposed to somebody else?
No, if God is an absolutely simple essence, you don't know you don't know that you're actually experiencing any of these things. You can only do analogical predication
because the effect, right, the thing which I am seeing, right, which
you don't know that a created effect is an action of love because you don't know God himself.
But I think you're just getting the sequence of questions backwards, right? So what I mean by love just is, right, that by which you do this kind of operation.
You don't know that God is doing that.
I don't know that this operation that I see in front of me is an act of love. Is that what you're saying?
You don't know that God is doing that act of love because God is outside of time and space and absolutely simple, according to this doctrine. So
it could be somebody else.
Say what?
You're saying it could be, for all I know, it could be somebody else.
Maybe God is exacting justice on you. You don't know. Because all
maybe
of
I'm just
attributes
I really am not following this line of argument.
If
Right, so
all
it
of the
seems that
attributes are the exact same as the essence and all the attributes are synonymous with one another, you never know God or what you're actually experiencing within history is from God.
I don't see how that follows at all. Right, so it seems as though it's perfectly possible for one and the same form that just on the level of creatures, forget God for the moment, just on the level of creatures, it's perfectly possible for one and the same
But
form.
the reasoning up from creatures doesn't work.
Hold on. It's perfectly possible for one and the same form to be responsible for different operations and thus for different manifestations. Right? To give
That doesn't work for God. You can't.
What?
You can't reason that up to God like Thomas want to do. I'm telling you, what I'm trying to argue is that the analogia doesn't work in your view.
No. Wait,
because God is absolutely simple. If you believed in the essence energy distinction, it would work.
No. But you're going to have to repeat. But let me restate why I'm having
some attributes are the same, and they're the divine essence. Therefore, within time and space, you don't actually experience God's love or God's mercy. You don't know what you're experiencing if you're experiencing God at all, because all you experience is created effects.
No.
There's no analog between what's in your mind and the absolutely simple essence where all the attributes are melded into one giant monad.
No. Bear with me for a sec and tell me which part of this picture you're being bothered by, okay? So I see this, let's say I'm Adam, okay? And let's say I know let's say by revelation, whatever, that God just made this place and that he gave me all this stuff up to and including this helpmate who's pretty awesome for my good.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitionally an act of love, right?
I mean, I'm asking you how you know that God did that out of love.
Let's say God said so.
Well, now you're relying on
no.
Which is what we would agree. Yeah, you should rely on revelation. You can't rely on all these created effects.
Okay. Let me see if I can restate it. So to say that something is an act of love, right, means that it is done consciously, right? It's not done randomly. It's done deliberately for the good of another. Yeah?
Okay.
And so what you're asking is, how is it that I can tell that this act that is the creation of the world around me is an act which was deliberate and which was done for my good?
I mean, I don't know how many times I can restate the argument. It's because it's a very simple argument. I'm not trying to be mean.
I'm saying, are you denying that? I just want a yes or no.
No, I believe that God created the world in love, absolutely, but that's because there's a direct bridge between God and the world.
That's not what I was asking, though. Right? So I'm just saying this thing out here. Maybe this is the trouble, right? So you're saying that you can only know whether something counts as an act of love if I have some sort of direct independent access to the source from which it sprang. And I'm saying that it works exactly the opposite way, and that I assume that I infer, if you like, that there is a source from which it sprang if I see the operation, right? So I don't have any direct access to your love, and I never will. Right? All that I have access to is your operations of love, and I know that whenever there is an operation, there is corresponding to it something by virtue of which this operation happened. And that something I call the habit of love. And it's exactly the same in God. It's just that in the case of God, that habit isn't a habit.
I mean, you're just stating the position. You're not addressing the point, which is that the God that you're talking about is absolutely simple, and all the attributes are identified.
Right, but what I'm trying to say is to call this act an act of love, I don't need to already know what it sprang from. The direction of inference goes the other way. Right? It seems as though you're saying that in order to know that this is an act of love, I have to first have access to that from which it came.
I know you're reasoning up from creatures, and you're saying creaturely love suggests that there's some ultimately divine love. And I'm saying that doesn't work because, for one, what you say God is in terms of absolute divine simplicity bears no resemblance to the creaturely love that you're trying to make it analogous to.
And that's just what I fail to see, because it seems like the resemblance.
Because all the attributes are identified.
You will the good for me. God wills the good for me.
Because all of the attributes are identified with the divine essence, and the distinctions are only creaturely. So if the distinctions are only creaturely, you never know if the creaturely idea in your head actually matches up to the absolutely simple essence that it's supposed to mirror.
Let's see if there's another way I can do this. It seems to me that what you're presupposing here is that in order for a predication of a term to be truly predicated of a subject, the term has to be isomorphic in content with some discrete reality in the subject. Right? So in other words, in order for me to say that you are just, there has to be something in you which has just something real, something distinct from all the other rest of the parts of you, which has just what I mean by the word justice and nothing else. Are you committed to that?
I'm kind of getting a little flustered here, not because of, I think we're going around and around in circles, because you're just restating what analogical predication is. And I'm asking you to explain how you can really predicate of God if all of the attributes of God and the names of God are absolutely identical to the divine essence. And you just
and I'm doing my best to explain that, but I'm just trying to make sure that
but you're just restating what analogical predication is. And I know what it is. So
okay.
Again, the question,
I'm just asking you to like agree with me or disagree as I go, so I know where I need to set up my my battle lines. Are you committed to saying that in order for a true predication to happen, the formal content of the term I'm predicating has to be exactly coextensive with a real thing, a real form of the subject?
No, we don't believe in univocal predication.
Okay. So if that's the case, why can't it be that two of my terms should have a formal content which is less than their referent to which I'm applying them?
Because the referent, namely God in this case, is completely different because he's absolutely simple, and all of the predicates are identical.
Here we are going in circles. Okay. Let me see if I can try this another way.
And by the way, it doesn't work either to say, let's start with creaturely love and then reason up, because we all know what love is. No, we don't. In fact, that's a classical foundationalist assumption from this kind of epistemology that we would reject. You don't have a clear idea of something like self-evident maxims or something like this that you can then reason up to build up to God. In fact, if there's no way to understand those maxims or those foundations epistemologically or logically or whatever without presupposing God's existence.
Well, that's a whole other argument. Do you want to keep on going with analogy for a bit, or should we just try?
I'm going to have to go. Let's take some super. So people who are listening, if you want to ask questions, I'm sure this will take a few minutes, but
Sure.
You can ask your super chat questions now. We already have a couple here. One from Guillermus Rusius for $5. He says, the Father uncreated, the Son uncreated, the Holy Ghost uncreated, not three uncreated, but one uncreated Athanasian Creed. Actually, even Rome admits that the Athanasian Creed was not composed by Athanasius. It's a later forgery, and the Orthodox Church does not accept the Athanasian Creed. But yes, we agree that all three of the persons are uncreated. Guillermus Rusius, again for $5. When the Paraclete cometh, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father. Proceeds from the Father is a statement of in our view, hypostatic origin, and the Father as the sole arche is the only source of the Spirit. Jesus says he will send the Spirit into time and history. All Orthodox writers believe in the mission of the Spirit being sent by Jesus. This is why it began the debate making the distinction between economia, or the mission of the Spirit within history, the eternal manifestation of the Spirit, which applies the Augustinian psychological analogy in St. Gregory Palamas. The Son eternally manifests the Spirit, but then in terms of hypostatic origins, the Father alone is the arche, soul, and cause of the persons, in our view. Are there any more super chats? If not, I think we will call it to a close. Give them a few minutes. Yeah, man, this was pretty intense, pretty heated, pretty deep stuff. I appreciate you coming on and doing it. And if we get a few more,
I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah.
If we get a few more super chats, I'll split the money with you. But
oh gosh, no, don't worry about that.
Well, I always do that with guests. Any of you Theo nerds out there want to ask questions? Send us some money. What did we do 2 hours?
A little bit over. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more super chats, so I guess we'll call it a close. And thank you, Dr. Feingold. Very eloquent, very good at explicating his positions. Good defender of Thomism. We will think about this.
Get to my Thomistic heresies, but
let's stew on this for a while, and we'll come back with maybe a part 2.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. God bless and have a good day.
Thank you, Jack.
You too, man.